with as many as 60. So, and when I would teach a smaller class, the ladies in the front would say, "Oh, please." I'm happy to introduce Paul Benson today. Paul and I have shown up at the same places, some throughout our lives, sometimes at the same time, and sometimes not. And Paul has a BA, MA, and PhD that he got at 3 different institutions, which means he had to prove himself 3 different times. If you go to one school and get your degree in one, they show favoritism. So that's a hard way to do it, Paul. And at any rate, I've attended many of his talks over the years, and he's received many awards in both teaching and innovation, and is on the National Board of Directors of the National Humanities, Junior College Humanities Association. So if I spent all my time telling you everything he's done, we wouldn't get finished. But I've attended many of his talks, and I've always appreciated the talk itself, but I always leave here with the sidelights that he presents on my mind. I still haven't gotten over what he's done with word sources, and he didn't let me down today. He's doing it again. I love that. In fact, now he's got me going around every time I read another word I wasn't sure about where it came from. He's got me wondering about it and even looking it up in a dictionary. You've been a bad influence. But I will say this, the one thing that's kind of amazing about him to me is I've come to the conclusion the guy does not sleep at night. He must stay up reading because he keeps coming up with so much new information that's very, very interesting. So it's with a lot of appreciation and an honor to present Dr. Paul Benson, professor at Mountain View College.
Thank you, Chris. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. I enjoy my annual pilgrimages over here to Unity. We have a great time, and now so many of you are dear friends. Thank you for coming. Before I start, I want to remind you that today is one of the most extraordinary events that I've had the pleasure of attending in the holiday season, and that is the famous Boar's Head Festival at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. It's always the first weekend in January. They had it yesterday, and now they'll have it today at 3 and 5 p.m. at University Christian Church, which is the church, the campus church, and the big church in Fort Worth. They're next to the TCU campus. And at 3 and 5, they present essentially a 1-hour medieval pageant, which is an extraordinary thing to see. It costs nothing to see. You just show up and watch it. And every year, I'm just flabbergasted, even though I've seen it now about 15 years. It's just an extraordinary thing. So I want to encourage you, those of you who've never even heard about this, to go. We have folks here that have been many times, and it's something that you want to do at least once to know what it's about. And then if you're like me, you get hooked, and you can't not go. It just seems impossible to end the holiday season without going to the Boar's Head. So if you can slip away for 1 hour, 3 o'clock or 5 p.m., it's easy to find as you go up to TCU. It's the first thing you come to as you get approach the campus. Big church. Today I want to talk about something that started back about a number of years ago. I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about George Bush, George W. Bush in his presidency, and they said George Bush had been reading a book called Salt. And I thought, why would he be reading about salt, right? So that encouraged me to figure that out. Eventually I got the book, and I learned so much from that book. Then it got me interested in pepper, then from pepper to spices, and spices, you know, comfort food and all that. So this is going to be a crazy time here. I'm here for the first time, the entire month of January, and on Sundays. So if you can come to all, or if you can come to some, I hope you will be able to, because we're going to learn a lot of things that are so surprising to me. You know, I think about this every time I sit down at a restaurant. There's a salt and pepper shaker. We pay no attention to it at all unless you need some salt and pepper. And could you catch the door? Yeah, see if it'll shut.
Okay, we're going to have people coming in from the 9 o'clock
Okay.
service, so we're going to probably need to set up some more chairs.
Oh, okay.
So this is our first Sunday to do this.
So there's little
learning.
little learning curve here.
Right.
Right. Well, that's fine. We're happy to have them. But anyway, if you could go back in time, though the amount of pepper and the amount of salt in each salt and pepper shaker were literally worth their weight in gold. It took such an enormous effort to get salt and pepper, particularly pepper. I mean, you had to be 16 months in the ship to get over there, and in many cases, 2/3 of the ship people died. I mean, this is one of these things that's so hard to appreciate what effort they went to get pepper. And salt was not easy. You know, nowadays they found big salt mines and salt domes and all of this, but they did not have, salt was not easy to come by in the early days, and so salt became very precious. And they had special little containers they keep salt in because they were so valuable. Now, I want to talk to you, first of all, about salt. We'll start with salt, and then pepper will come in, and I want to bring this up a little bit. I hope this doesn't mess up the camera, Jerry. And,
No, we're fine.
I don't know if you can all see this, but I want to get this out front so you can take a look at these words. The first word is a Latin word, salax. Salax. So we don't use salax, but we use the word relax, right? Relax literally means, lax means loose. So relax means to re-loosen, right? You get all wired up during the day, right? And then you get home, lay down, and you relax, right? Well, salax is the same thing, only with salt. To relax, your salt relaxed. Now, what in the world does that mean, right? Well, if a man is in love, if a man is particularly enraptured with a woman, they'll say he's in the state of salax. See? In other words, he's salt loose. He's been loosened up. And because salt from ancient times is associated with fertility. And this is one of those extraordinary things that comes to us through Latin. This idea that salt, if a man is in a state of salt, that means his libido is running, the testosterone is going, everything is running, and he is very excited about being with a woman, have a romantic time. Many of you have heard me talk about Valentine's Day and the roots of Valentine and how this all goes back to Roman fertility festival known as Lupercalia. Well, anyway, the saltlax, we get the word from saltlax in English that we do use called salacious. Salacious. Now, unfortunately, this word has taken on a lot of negative connotations, right? A person is very salacious. They're sort of overactive in their libido, right? So, but the original intention was not that at all, because what are the Romans interested in? More Romans. How do you get more Romans? More fertility. And this is why during the month of February, which is the month of the fever, they had these strange rituals they did to promote fertility. And so this is one of these things that is very, very important. Also, we have the word salary. Now, all of you, I'm sure, at some time or another receive a salary. This means a payment of salt. Now, why do we say salary? Because the Roman government paid the soldiers in salt. Salt, down through the years, has been like gold is today, I suppose. It's a commodity that people believe in, and it was hard to come by. So they had to mine it at a great expense, and that salt caused them to give it value, and so they'd measure out a certain amount of salt, and then you take that as your pay, and of course you could trade that salt for something valuable, right? So if you get far enough back, the Romans did have coins, but there was still a lot of bartering going on, and salt was one of the primary things. So this is what they had. And in fact, the road going north out of Rome is called the Salt Road because it went to the salt mines. And from this, of course, where they got the salt to pay the soldiers. By the way, in French, just this is an oddity. Sal is Latin, salt, right? So solde is the French translation of salt. Now just guess what word we get from solde. Soldier, because the very early French soldiers, of course, were Romans, and they were paid in salt. So you have this transition of meaning from salt. If you think, it sounds like salt soldiers or salt men, but that's not the point. The point is that there are men that are paid in salt, and that was a status thing. If you had salt, you were somebody. That's why in the way back in Greeks and Romans, they'd have these containers, beautiful silver, even gold containers, keep the salt in. And sometimes even under lock and key because salt was so valuable. Well, anyway, we see salt in a lot of places. The city of Salzburg, Austria, was a salt city because they did a lot of salt trading there. And the word salad, you go to lunch and you have your salad, right? So how does salt get associated with that? Because the Romans, when they started eating greens, too blah, right? So they put salt on top, before we had Thousand Island and Ranch and all the other nonsense we put on, right? They put on salt. And so that's where we get the word salad. The salsa, this is pretty easy, right? It's a salty condiment that we put on usually on Mexican food. Salami, right? Now, here's an interesting word, sauerkraut. Now, sauerkraut, believe it or not, comes from the Latin, comes from Romans. You never think of Romans as being sauerkraut eaters. They were huge sauerkraut eaters. The reason is because if you think about sour, what sour mean? It's the same word as in English, right? Sour. And it tastes sour. And kraut is cabbage. See, sour cabbage. So it's fermented cabbage, but they had to use, what they put a lot of salt for preservative. So cabbage, salt would last a long time, right? I mean, sauerkraut lasts a long time and as a preservative. And so this is one of the things that we have to appreciate is the importance of salt as a preservative. And it's used over and over. By the way, the British Navy. Now, do you ever think the British is eating sauerkraut? I mean, is that something you just automatically think of? No. You think of the Germans as eating sauerkraut, right? But the British had sauerkraut for one purpose. You want to guess what it was? Because sauerkraut, if you ate sauerkraut, you wouldn't have scurvy. And they figured that out. So, in every British port in the world, they have a sauerkraut station. In other words, they would process and store sauerkraut, and then when the British ship came in, exhausted of the sauerkraut that they had, they would get a new supply of sauerkraut so they could go on to the next place, right? Sauerkraut stations run by the British Navy. Unbelievable, right? Yeah. So this is some of the things that are surprising. By the way, starting about the time of the birth of Christ, the Romans every year would send 120 ships at a particular time to go to India to bring back spices and peppers. And they were very big on that for the next 300 years or so. And then from about 400 until Da Gama went around the Horn and went to in 1498. There was very little sea traffic. All the spices came over the Silk Road, right? Now, when the Romans got there to India to get the pepper, guess who they found? This is so unbelievable. I went to a program on this one time, and I was just floored when I heard this news. When the Romans got there, guess who they found? Well, they found Indians, of course, in India, and they did their trading, but they found Jewish communities. The Jews had been there already 300 years in the spice business on the Malabar coast of India, right? You know why they went there? This is astonishing. They went there because Alexander the Great came in 300 years or so before the time of Christ. They came in. Don't bother. Please come over. We have chairs over here. Feel free to come across. Any of you that want to have a seat. They were afraid that Alexander and the Greek religion was going to contaminate Judaism. We could argue that that's probably the case. And so that 300 years, Alexander, they lived in India. Now, why do you suppose? Think about this a minute. Why would the Jews leave Israel and go all the way to India? I mean, that's a tremendous journey, right? And an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And yet they did it. They planted communities in India which have survived to modern times. Now, why would they do that? Why India? Why not go to Greece? Or why not go to, not Greece, of course. Why not go to, say, Egypt? Well, Egypt was also controlled by Alexander the Great. And so why do they go to India? Why do they choose India?
There's money there.
Well, yeah, the spices were there. Yeah, that's the dark answer. I was hoping for a brighter answer. Yeah. So the answer, of course, is that the Jews were interested in keeping their religion unchanged and intact in the way it was, and the freest country in the world in those days, and maybe even to this day, is India, because the Indians have always supported a variety of gods and deities, which are sometimes umbrellaed under the term Hinduism. But if you think about it, there's big differences in Hinduism, but always this idea, you're free to worship whatever God you want to worship. This was extraordinary in the years before the time of the birth of Christ. So that's where they went and planted themselves there. Now, speaking of the East, I want to mention something that's really important in this whole spice discussion. And that is, of course, Marco Polo. Now, why is Marco Polo? You know, some people have even intimated that he made the whole thing up, you know. And he doesn't mention, Marco Polo does not mention certain things about China, which you think would be obvious. And for example, he doesn't mention tea, right? China, tea, not one word about tea. But the answer, of course, to that is that when he got to China, who were in charge? The Mongols. The Mongols don't drink tea. He was at the Mongol court of Kublai Khan. And so this is an amazing thing, because when he writes his travels in the 13th century, that of course becomes he writes down some notes which, again, somebody else took and worked into his famous book called Travels. And that may have been, shall we say, embellished a little bit. But Marco Polo's travel book was a book among the books that Christopher Columbus took with him in 1492. Now, think about this. Where is Christopher Columbus headed? He knows that the Portuguese have come down the coast of Africa, and he knows, you know, ultimately they're going to get there. In fact, 6 years later, they do get there. In other words, a sea route to the to the Indies, right? Where Columbus is headed is the Spice Islands. He's trying to get a dead reckoning on the Spice Islands, and he knows what he knows a little bit. He knows about the East. He knows from two sources. He knows from Marco Polo, and then he knows from the traders that have gone all the way on the Silk Road and brought back spices. See, that's why spices were so expensive, because this is such a long travel. Now, what's important to remember here is the number one spice by far was black pepper. It still is today. Of all the spices, black pepper is the most important. The Romans had it in so many of their foods, and pepper was just so valuable that that's what he really wanted to go. So he went looking for pepper, and he discovered a new world. But unfortunately for Columbus, never realized that, right? He's still thinking, oh boy, you know, he tried 4 trips, he's all over, right? I've got to be near. He didn't realize the Pacific Ocean. By the way, he was in the Isthmus of Panama, went a ways in, but it was awful, you know, malaria and all this, and he didn't go. He'd gone another 2 days march, he would have discovered the Pacific. Well, anyway, Columbus is one of these people that brings ultimately causes the whole thing of pepper to be important, because what he's doing, he's emphasizing pepper, and then everybody goes looking for pepper, most particularly the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, of course, are also motivated by something else that's so important to understand here, and that is they're motivated. Wait till folks can get in here. They're motivated, the Portuguese, to not let the Spanish get ahead of them, not so that the Spanish do not take over, and all these new discoveries, right? So now think about this. In 1494, 2 years after Columbus discovers the New World, 2 years, the Portuguese are going to the Pope and saying, this isn't fair, we should have. So, just show you how much power, how much authority the Pope had in the 15th century. The Pope, Alexander VI, Borgia Pope from the Borgia family. He sets up the Treaty of Tordesillas, and he divides the world. Everything except Europe, he divides between two countries, Spain and Portugal. What about Italy? What about France? I mean, what about any other country? He divides it, and then that line gets adjusted a little bit. This is why the Portuguese get Brazil. And the Portuguese, of course, get Africa. And so there were many Portuguese colonies, of course, in Africa. The Spanish never were much of a presence in Africa because of this treaty, right? Now, how did this all tie together? It ties together in an extraordinary way. Is that these countries are wanting to monopolize, if they possibly can, the spice trade, right? They do have salt in Europe, so salt isn't so important to them, but spice is extraordinarily important. And so they fight wars, and they spend enormous fortunes trying to get spice and then ultimately gold from the New World. It's said that the one thing that bankrupted Spain more than anything else was gold, because they thought when they had gold, they thought they were rich, and in fact it made them poor. And this is always a kind of a morality tale about putting too much emphasis on one commodity, right? Okay, so anyway, salt and pepper then become very important. Salt is so important because of they use it as a preservative, and the thing that they liked to preserve with salt is cod. Cod, and then later herring. So because cod they go up into the North Atlantic, these fleets. Strangely enough, the Basque people were huge into this, and they brought back all this cod and salted all this cod, and cod became the main food through the winter, because it would survive the winter, whereas everything else would perish. And for many people in the Middle Ages, it became so important, this cod business and herring was crucial to their economies, right? Particularly in Northern Europe. And so they developed in the 13th, 14th century what we call today a multinational corporation called the Hanseatic League. Now the Hanseatic League is a most amazing and fascinating organization because its main purpose is to control, monopolize salt and salt products such as cod, right? Look at this statistic. The Hanseatic League had 40,000 ships. 40,000 ships and 300,000 employees at its height, right? All to control the trading of salt and cod. Anyway, here it comes.
When was
13th century, so 1200 essentially, Middle Ages. Now here's what's, I think, the most fascinating thing of all about the Hanseatic League. So the Hanseatic League is basically Germany, Scandinavia, the Dutch, up in that northern part of the world. The Hanseatic League were famous for their high ethics, business ethics. It gives you an idea, I suppose, how bad business ethics were in those days. And so in England, they liked to deal with the Hanseatic League because if the Hanseatic League said, we will deliver so much salt on such a day and it'll cost so much, they would. And they became famous for that. So the people in England called these Hanseatic League employees, they called them Easterlings. Easterlings, right? Now, and the Easterling became code word for high standards and high ethics and quality. Guess what word that became in English? Easterlings. Here it comes, sterling. You know what they call the British pound? Pound sterling. They don't say pound whatever. The pound, of course, is the denomination, which is funny in a way too, because of that strange history. It's not really a pound at all. It goes back to the same word as lira, but that's another story. The story here is that Easterling becomes sterling. So in England, you'll say somebody, in English, will say, somebody has a sterling character, meaning highest quality, highest ethics. This comes from the word Easterling, applying to these employees of the Hanseatic League. So I'm really fascinated. By the way, salt and other spices caused a lot of political problems down through the years. In France, they had a tax called a gabelle, Gabelle, gabelle. Now the gabelle was because the government of France wanted to control, this is in the 17th, 18th century, they wanted to control salt, and so they required, if you can imagine this, everybody in the country had to buy 15 pounds of salt per year. Well, you can say, well, they could use the salt. The problem is they had to buy it at the fixed price of the government, which was very, very high. So this was like, for some people, like a small fortune, right, to buy their annual supply of salt. And so this caused lots of trouble. It became the #1 source of revenue for the French government, leading up to Louis XVI, and of course Marie Antoinette and all that, and eventually was one of the causes, certainly not the only cause, but one of the causes of the French Revolution, 1789. But here again, a government, not just taxing, but very extreme taxing. And by the way, there's a connection in America between salt and taxing. Back in the 1790s, there's an event we know as the Whiskey Rebellion. Whiskey. Now, whiskey is an interesting word. Whiskey comes from a Gaelic word, which is a translation of a Latin word, which is actually 2 words, aqua viva. Aqua, water, vita, life, water of life, which is wine distilled, but not just into brandy, distilled over and over and over again to where it's really high alcohol content, right? Anyway, aqua vita goes into Gaelic, and of course, among the great purveyors of whiskey were the Scotch-Irish, right? What do they speak originally? Gaelic. And then, so this comes kind of mangled into English as whiskey. So anyway, there's a whiskey rebellion. Now here was what was happening out in western Pennsylvania. So in western Pennsylvania, what the people were doing, they didn't want to pay the tax. This is one of the first taxes of the American government, right? One of the very first taxes of the American government was the whiskey excise tax, right? And it was high. And they didn't want to pay it. So what they did out in western Pennsylvania is they would trade it for salt. Because guess what? Salt was all